The city had been soaked for hours. It was one of those New York evenings where the rain didn't just fall, it pressed against everything, drenching the sidewalks, blurring street lights, and turning the overpass into a slick mirror of neon and sorrow. Caleb Morris had made this route dozens of times. School bus, Shocker 214, his route, his kids, same streets, same stops. But tonight something was different. He didn't notice it right away. He was humming under his breath as he usually did while the kids in the back cracked jokes and shared snacks. They'd just finished a school trip to the museum. A couple of them were still arguing over which dinosaur could win in a fight. Caleb smiled through the rearview mirror, adjusted the heater, and turned on his wipers to full. The overpass loomed ahead, a wide gray stretch above the interstate. Nothing unusual, until he saw her. It was a flicker at first, a shadow maybe, a coat flapping against the wind. He squinted. She wasn't behind the railing, she was outside it, standing with her toes over the edge. Her arms were limp at her sides, soaked to the bone. She didn't flinch as cars zoomed by beneath her or as wind swept up her long dark hair. Caleb's foot eased off the gas. Then instinct took over. He pulled to the side, flipped on the hazard lights, and threw the bus into park. "Kids, stay inside. I'll be right back." His voice was calm, but the kids could sense something had shifted. He didn't have a raincoat, just his blue driver's uniform already damp from a leaky roof at the depot. He walked out into the storm, his shoes slipping slightly on the slick concrete. Each step toward her felt like he was crossing into something sacred, something fragile. He didn't want to startle her. She hadn't seen him yet. As he approached, he noticed her heels, expensive but soaked. Her blouse clung to her skin. Her makeup had long since run down her cheeks. But what struck him most was the stillness. No shaking, no sobbing. Just silence, as if she had already left the world in her mind. He stopped a few feet behind her. The rain beat down harder now, like it was trying to say something no one could hear. "I'm not here to stop you," he said gently, his voice barely audible through the downpour. "I just thought, maybe you'd rather be on this side. It's warmer here." She didn't turn. The wind picked up, and for a moment he thought she might let go. His heart pounded, but he didn't move closer. He stayed still, hands at his sides, offering nothing but presence. Then finally she moved. Just a slight shift at first. Her shoulders trembled. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes met his, wet, vacant, but searching. And then, like a thread being pulled back from the edge, her knees buckled, and she stepped down. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. She didn't say a word. She just wept into his chest as the rain poured harder than ever. He took off his jacket and wrapped it around her. She clung to him like a lifeline. Behind them, the children pressed their faces against the bus windows. They didn't understand what had happened, but they knew something real had taken place, something big. Caleb guided her to sit on the steps of the overpass, shielding her as best he could from the wind. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I was going to do it. I really was." He didn't answer right away. He just nodded and said, "I'm glad you didn't." They sat there for a while, just the two of them, strangers in a storm, until the police arrived. No names were exchanged. No headlines were written. Caleb didn't even mention it to his supervisor the next day. To him, it was just what anyone should have done. But what he didn't know was that he hadn't saved just a life. He had awakened something long buried, something powerful. And the woman he had held in his arms, Vivian Lane, was about to change his life in return. The next morning, Caleb went back to his route as usual. The sky was clearer, the air washed and still, as if the storm had rinsed the city of something heavy. He didn't say a word about what happened the night before, not to his coworkers, not to the kids, not even to his wife. He simply showed up like he always did, humming a tune under his breath as the little ones boarded the bus with sticky fingers and bright eyes. But across town, Vivian Lane was waking up to something she hadn't felt in years, breath in her lungs that didn't hurt to take in. She sat in the guest room of a small crisis center, wrapped in a donated robe, her designer dress still hanging damp in a bag near the door. Her eyes were swollen, her hands still shook, but she was alive. And that fact alone felt so impossible, so raw, that she cried again, not from sadness this time, but from the bewildering lightness of still being here. A nurse walked in with tea. Vivian took it with both hands and whispered, "Do you know the name of the man who brought me in?" The nurse paused. The driver, "No, he didn't say much. Just made sure you were safe and left before anyone could ask questions. But he looked like he really cared." Vivian nodded slowly, the warmth of the cup grounding her. She didn't remember everything clearly. The rain, the sound of traffic far below, the quiet of the man's voice, the way his arms had felt steady strong, like nothing could shake him. But what stayed with her most was how he never pressured her, never told her not to feel what she felt. He just stood there present. That presence alone had pulled her back from the edge. By the end of the week, she was discharged. No reporters had caught wind of the incident. Her name had been withheld, and thankfully she hadn't made the evening news. It wasn't something she wanted headlines for anyway. This wasn't some redemption arc for public consumption. This was personal. She returned to her penthouse overlooking the Hudson, same furniture, same silence, but it no longer swallowed her. Instead, the space felt like a blank canvas, and the first thing she wrote on it was a mission: find him. It wasn't easy. She had no name, no license plate, just a vague memory of a yellow school bus and the words Route 14 printed near the windshield. It took dozens of phone calls, some to the Department of Education, others to bus depots across the boroughs, until she reached someone who remembered a route that had briefly stopped on the overpass during the rainstorm that Tuesday night. Caleb Morris, the dispatcher, said, "He drives for us, always on time. Good guy. Quiet." Vivian closed her eyes. The name clicked into place like a final puzzle piece. Caleb. She spent the next day in front of the mirror deciding what to wear. She rejected the designer labels. Something about showing up in silk and stilettos felt wrong. Instead, she chose a soft blue sweater and jeans, simple, approachable. She pulled her hair back, minimal makeup, not because she wanted to impress him, but because she wanted to meet him as she truly was. When she arrived at the bus yard, Caleb had just finished his morning route. His jacket was slung over his shoulder, his shirt damp with sweat from the midday sun. He was walking toward the staff room when he saw her standing near the gate, hands clasped nervously in front of her. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. She wasn't crying, wasn't soaked, wasn't broken. She looked awake. "Mr. Morris," she said, her voice soft. He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "I don't know if you remember me," she started, but he raised a hand gently. "I do." Vivian felt her throat tighten. She took a deep breath. "You saved me. I never got to thank you properly." Caleb smiled, modest as always. "I didn't do much. Just didn't walk away. But you could have," she said, her voice thick. "Most people would have," he shrugged. "That ain't how I was raised." And just like that, the distance between them dissolved. Two people from different worlds bound by a moment neither of them would ever forget. Vivian reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. "I'd like to make you an offer," she said. "A chance to do more of what you did for me on a bigger scale." Caleb looked at the envelope, then at her, and without touching it, he simply said, "Tell me more." Vivian didn't expect Caleb to accept right away. In fact, as she stood across from him in the modest staff break room with its humming vending machine, faded linoleum tiles, and a half-drunk cup of instant coffee left by someone in a rush, she realized this man didn't live in the same world she did. Not just economically, but emotionally. His pace was slower, more deliberate, the kind that came from choosing substance over spectacle. She explained carefully, almost cautiously, what she had in mind: a leadership role within the outreach wing of her company. It wasn't just a title, it came with influence, with a platform. She spoke of initiatives they'd been quietly planning for years, but never fully realized: scholarships for inner-city youth, mental health access programs in underserved communities, transportation aid for struggling single parents. "You'd be helping thousands," she said, watching his eyes for any flicker of reaction. "Maybe even more. You'd be able to," Caleb cut in gently, not unkindly, just firm. "I appreciate it, Miss Lane. Truly, but I already got what I want." She blinked. "You? What do you mean?" He looked away for a moment, the way someone does when they're choosing their words, not for clarity, but for truth. "I drive that bus because those kids, for a lot of them, I'm the first adult they see every morning, and the last one before they get home. That matters," he said. "They trust me. I give them consistency. I give them calm. I don't need a suit to make a difference." Vivian stood silent, absorbing that. Her world had always been about scale. Bigger reach, broader networks, louder voices. But this man, he operated on the scale of presence, of quiet daily impact. "I thought maybe you'd want a new path," she said softly. "That night on the bridge, you changed the course of my life. I just wanted to offer the chance for you to change more." He smiled this time with more warmth. "I do, Miss Lane. Every weekday at 6:55 a.m. when I open that door and say good morning to 23 kids who didn't ask for the lives they were born into. That's enough for me." Vivian looked down at the envelope still in her hand. Its crisp corners suddenly felt heavy with irrelevance. She nodded her lips, pressing into a thoughtful line. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." And it could have ended there. But it didn't. Because Vivian Lane, for all her trauma and tragedy, hadn't lost her capacity to build. Her pain hadn't turned her cold, it had made her want to give. And Caleb, though he walked away from her offer, had planted something in her, that night something sacred. Over the next few weeks, Vivian disappeared from the headlines. While the world speculated about her sudden absence, she met quietly with lawyers, nonprofit consultants, educators, and community organizers. And when she finally stepped back into the public eye, it was not as a fashion icon or media darling. It was as the founder of the Caleb Foundation, a nonprofit committed to honoring the kind of impact that can't be measured in dollars or digital reach. Its mission to support school bus drivers, janitors, crossing guards, and other invisible heroes who make quiet contributions in children's lives every day. Vivian personally funded scholarships for the children of low-income drivers. She launched a mental wellness hotline for education workers. She organized annual retreats, modest, humble gatherings where everyday workers could come together, rest, and remember their worth. Caleb, true to form, didn't speak at the launch event. He sat quietly in the back row, wearing the same blue jacket he always wore, his hands folded in his lap. When Vivian mentioned his name in her speech, her voice thick with emotion, her hand gesturing toward him, the crowd turned to applaud. Caleb only nodded, tipping his cap ever so slightly, then looked down embarrassed by the attention. After the event, as people crowded around her, Vivian slipped away for a moment and sat beside him on the wooden bench outside the community center. The sun was setting, casting gold through the autumn trees. "I hope you're okay with what I did," she said, half joking, half vulnerable. He chuckled. "You didn't need my permission. I kinda did." Caleb looked at her for a long beat, then replied, "You didn't change because of me, Vivian. You remembered who you were." That stayed with her, not just that night, but for years. In the months that followed, the Caleb Foundation gained quiet momentum. It didn't make the evening news every week, and it never trended on social media. But word of mouth, especially among school districts, small-town communities, and support staff networks, spread like wildfire. For once, the janitors, the cafeteria workers, the drivers who'd gone decades unnoticed started receiving thank you notes, recognition dinners, and even handwritten cards from students who had grown up and remembered their names. Caleb never sought the spotlight. He continued his route each morning as if nothing had changed. His old bus, affectionately nicknamed the Yellow Angel by the kids, had become something of a legend in the neighborhood. Children, even those who didn't ride with him, waved as he passed. Some parents began sending extra lunch bags, labeling them for Mr. Caleb. He never turned them down. He also never kept them. He passed the food quietly to the kids who he knew didn't always get breakfast. Vivian, on the other hand, was learning how to live without drowning in noise. She had stepped away from the boardrooms, from the suffocating world of forced smiles and calculated partnerships. Her days were slower now, mornings with tea, afternoons spent reading grant proposals, evenings walking through neighborhoods she used to speed past in a chauffeured SUV. And yet every so often she found herself wondering about that night, not out of trauma, but out of awe. How a moment, just one, could fracture the shell of a life and expose something still warm underneath. She never told the public the full story, never revealed that the foundation's name came from the man who talked her off the ledge. That remained private, sacred, a bond between two people who had nothing in common, but everything that mattered. Then one cold afternoon in December, a letter arrived at the foundation's mailbox. It was written in pencil on lined notebook paper in the uneven handwriting of a child. "Dear Miss Lane, Mr. Caleb is my bus driver. My mom lost her job, and we don't have a lot of food now. But Mr. Caleb brings me apples and says I'm brave. He says being scared doesn't mean you're not strong. He says it means you care. I didn't tell anyone, but I was sad all the time. Mr. Caleb helped me smile again. Thank you for helping him help us. Love or destiny age. 9. Vivian sat at her desk for a long while, the letter held gently between her hands, as if it might break under the weight of her emotion. She thought about Destiny's words about the way Caleb had reframed fear, not as weakness, but as evidence of love. And in that moment, she realized that the real work of the foundation had nothing to do with funding or strategy. It was about multiplying that kind of presence, that kind of grace. That night, she visited the school district anonymously requesting permission to sit in on Caleb's route the following morning, not to monitor, not to oversee, but simply to witness. The next day before sunrise, she climbed aboard his bus. It smelled faintly of vinyl seats and old crayons. The windows were fogged with breath. Caleb looked surprised when he saw her, but he said nothing, just tipped his cap and motioned toward the first row. As the children climbed in, some sleepy others, chattering a strange quiet, settled in Vivian's chest. She watched Caleb greet every single one by name, offer a smile or a high-five comment on a new hairstyle, a missing tooth, a lost mitten recovered. It was the smallest theater in the world, and yet it felt more human than any boardroom she'd ever entered. One boy dropped his backpack. Caleb knelt to help him. Another girl was crying softly. He handed her a tissue and whispered something that made her nod. She didn't stop crying, but she stopped hiding. Vivian looked around and saw not a vehicle, but a sanctuary, a place where chaos paused and someone cared. Later that week, she began drafting plans to expand the foundation's mission, not just to support the workers, but to provide safe spaces within schools for children to process grief, fear, and uncertainty. The morning room, she would call them quiet, welcoming corners in public schools, staffed by volunteers trained to listen. No curriculum, no tests, just presence. And though she knew Caleb would never ask for credit, she also knew he didn't need it. He was already living the truth. She'd only just begun to understand some people change the world not by shouting, but by sitting quietly beside someone who needs to be heard. The Morning Room initiative moved faster than Vivian had anticipated, not because of money, though she had that to offer, but because the idea itself struck a chord. Teachers, counselors, and principals responded with a kind of urgency that surprised her. "We've been waiting for something like this," one school director told her, over Zoom, voice cracking slightly. "We just didn't know what to call it." Within 3 months, 5 schools across Buffalo and Rochester had piloted the program. Each room was different, some tucked into unused libraries, others occupying repurposed storage areas, but the essence was always the same: a quiet space, soft lighting beanbags or chairs, a kettle of tea in the corner, and someone who listened without trying to fix. Children came not to be corrected, but to be held emotionally, sometimes even physically, when the world around them felt too sharp. Caleb, for his part, remained distant from the organizational machinery. He knew about the expansion, of course. Vivian kept him updated in her own unassuming way, leaving envelopes with reports on his front steps sometimes, with a post-it note saying, "You planted this." He never responded in writing, but every now and then, she'd catch him giving a subtle nod when she brought it up. "I'm glad," he once said. "Glad they have somewhere to go." That was all. But for him, it was enough. Then as winter began to thaw and spring crept through the city in reluctant patches of green, the story took an unexpected turn. A local journalist, intrigued by the rise of the Caleb Foundation, decided to dig a little deeper. She interviewed volunteers, school administrators, and even Vivian herself. But it was during an unrelated Freedom of Information request looking into police blotters and bridge surveillance footage from the previous fall that the truth surfaced. Vivian Lane had been the woman on the edge of the overpass, and Caleb Morris, the school bus driver, had saved her life. The headline didn't break the internet, but it broke something else, an illusion of separation. Suddenly, the foundation wasn't just another charity spearheaded by a wealthy philanthropist. It was a living testimony of redemption, of human connection in its rawest form. The news spread through the city like river water, finding its course. People shared it on Facebook. Teachers cried, reading the article aloud in break rooms. Students whose only knowledge of Vivian Lane had come from fashion magazines or business features began seeing her differently, not as someone who had it all, but someone who had almost lost it all and clawed her way back. And Caleb. He was furious, not at Vivian, he never once raised his voice to her, but at the world for prying into what he believed had been a sacred private exchange. He didn't want fame. He didn't want gratitude. You told me once, he said to her one rainy afternoon when she showed up on his porch, newspaper in hand, that I reminded you of who you were. But what if that night all I did was see who you already were? What if none of this had anything to do with me? Vivian listened. She didn't defend herself. She didn't try to explain that the story had leaked without her consent or that she'd never planned to make it public. She only said, maybe it wasn't about who helped who. Maybe it was just about what happened when two people stopped pretending they didn't need help. They sat on his porch for a while. After that, the silence between them, not awkward, but easy. A silence built from the comfort of having survived something together. The public attention eventually calmed. A few more articles came and went. A documentary crew reached out. Vivian declined on Caleb's behalf. He never knew. She protected that boundary the way he had protected her on that bridge. And though life moved on, something subtle shifted. Parents started teaching their children to look at the quiet ones, the invisible helpers. School buses were no longer just yellow boxes on wheels. They were places where morning rituals of care were performed one child at a time. Caleb became something he never asked to be, a symbol. And symbols, when they're true, have a way of outgrowing the people who spark them. But he didn't let it change him. He still rose before dawn, still drove his route, still kept apples in a cooler beside his seat. Only now sometimes, when he pulled up to a stop and saw a kid lingering, unsure, maybe nervous, he'd lean forward and say in that same calm voice he used that night on the bridge, "It's all right, sweetheart. Come on in. You're safe here." Spring leaned into summer, and the city bloomed with color gardens bursting from window boxes, children chalking rainbows on sidewalks, and teachers breathing easier as the school year neared its close. The morning room program had quietly expanded to 10 districts. Donations trickled in from unexpected places, retirees from neighboring towns, a famous author who'd once ridden a school bus just like Caleb's, even a group of high school students who'd held a bake sale to honor Mr. Morris, the man who saved somebody just by being kind. Vivian watched all of this from the periphery, careful not to center herself. She had returned to a quieter life, often declining interviews, politely avoiding galas. Her joy now came from handwritten letters, from photos children drew in crayon, some of Caleb, some of her, all with the same message scribbled underneath. You make people feel safe. But one day in early June, she received an invitation unlike the rest. It was a letter from the office of the governor. Vivian sat in her kitchen reading the heavy parchment twice before allowing herself to feel anything. It was brief, formal, but sincere. The governor would like to present the State Medal of Human Compassion to Mr. Caleb Morris in a public ceremony for his role in preventing a suicide and inspiring systemic support for at-risk children. Would she help ensure he attended? She set the letter down and exhaled slowly. She knew this would be difficult. When she knocked on Caleb's door that evening, he answered in a t-shirt, worn thin with age, hands dusted with flour. He'd been baking, a habit she learned he picked up on weekends. The kids like banana bread, he'd once said, as though it explained everything. She handed him the letter. He read it in silence, lips pressed in a firm line, then folded it neatly and handed it back. "I'm not going," he said, voice even. Vivian didn't argue, not right away. Instead, she sat across from him at the kitchen table, listening to the clock tick and the oven hum in the background. Why, she asked finally. He shrugged, looking away. "I didn't do anything special. I talked to someone who needed it." "That's it." She leaned forward. "That's the part you don't understand. Most people wouldn't have stopped. They would have kept driving or called someone else to handle it. You got out of the bus, Caleb. You walked into someone's storm and stayed." He didn't respond. She continued softly now. "And because of that, I'm still here. Hundreds of kids have a safe place to cry. Workers who were invisible now feel seen. Don't you see, it's not about you being a hero. It's about people remembering how to be human." Caleb looked down at his hands for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was quieter than before. "What if I don't want the attention?" Vivian smiled gently. "Then take the attention and shine it somewhere else." A week later, under the shade of towering elms outside the Capitol building, Caleb stood in a pressed navy shirt flanked by children from 3 different schools. Vivian stood to the side, hands folded, eyes bright. The ceremony was short. The governor praised his quiet valor, his transformative presence. When the medal was placed around Caleb's neck, a cheer erupted, not from the politicians, but from the kids. They clapped, they whistled, one little boy shouted, "That's my driver." Caleb didn't say much when he stepped to the podium. He cleared his throat once, looked over the crowd, and said, "I just try to do right by people. That's all. I think the world would be better if more of us did that." He stepped down to thunderous applause. After the ceremony, Vivian caught up with him by a lemonade stand the children had set up. He was crouched beside Destiny, the girl who had once written the letter that moved her to tears, helping her pour juice without spilling. "You did well," Vivian said quietly. He glanced up and grinned. "Still not sure what all the fuss is about." She chuckled. "That's exactly why it's you." As the sun dipped low and the event dispersed, Caleb stood for a moment near the edge of the lawn, watching families gather, teachers hug students and children pose, with volunteers in front of the morning room banners. He didn't see a legacy. He saw people. He saw what happens when one hand reaches back and pulls another forward, not for reward, not for credit, but because it's what people are meant to do. And somewhere deep in his chest, a quiet satisfaction settled, not pride, but peace. That summer, the school buses ran a little quieter. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe the way long days made the children sleepy before they even arrived. But for Caleb Morris, it was something else entirely. He found himself lingering at stops just a few seconds longer. Not out of forgetfulness, Caleb was never careless, but because he understood more than ever how much could change in the space of a pause. A moment, a gesture, every nod, every good morning. Every sandwich he quietly handed to a hungry child, he treated them as if they might echo far beyond what he could see. Because once one sentence he spoke had pulled someone from the edge of silence and into the breath of the living. Vivian, too, had changed, not in the way magazines used to chart success, but in the small, irreversible ways that matter. She didn't wear armor anymore. Not the corporate suits, not the perfectly rehearsed smiles, not the guarded distance that once kept her heart preserved but frozen. She learned how to be seen, and in turn how to see others. Truly see them. She began teaching weekly at one of the morning rooms, just one tucked inside a modest elementary school, where the windows stuck in the summer and the floors creaked like old bones. She never introduced herself as a CEO. To the kids, she was simply Miss V, the woman who brought lavender-scented notebooks and listened like the world outside the room didn't matter. One morning, a boy who barely spoke handed her a drawing of a school bus flying through the sky. "It's Mr. Morris's magic bus," he said shyly. "It goes to places where kids are safe." Vivian took the drawing home and pinned it above her desk. Not long after that, she received a call from a civic leadership summit in Atlanta. They wanted Caleb to come speak as a voice for working-class dignity, they said. She relayed the invitation, bracing herself for another refusal. But this time he surprised her. "I'll go," he said, sipping coffee on his porch. "But only if I get to bring Destiny," she smiled. Deal. The speech made headlines, not because it was grand or polished, it wasn't, but because it was real. Caleb didn't posture. He told the story of the bridge. He spoke of listening, of showing up, of how the most important part of any job wasn't the title, but the chance to give someone dignity. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just a man who opened a door." The room stood still. Afterward, a woman from Chicago came up to him in tears. Her husband had taken his life 3 years prior. She said if someone had said to him, "What you said to that girl," maybe he'd still be here. Caleb didn't know how to respond, so he hugged her. It felt like the only honest thing to do. Back in Buffalo, as autumn approached, Vivian officially turned over her company to a board of community trustees. It had taken years, but she was ready to let go. The Morning Room Foundation had become her true home, and she wanted to give it all the space it needed to grow. On the first day of the new school year, she stood by the sidewalk as Caleb's bus rolled in. Destiny was first to hop off, backpack bouncing, and she ran straight to Vivian with a grin missing 2 front teeth. Behind her, Caleb climbed out slowly, still limping slightly, from an old knee injury he never got fixed. He nodded toward Vivian, eyes soft. "You good?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I've ever been." They didn't say much after that. They never needed to. As the bus drove away, the sun caught on its windows, turning the metal into something golden. Vivian stood watching until it disappeared over the hill, her hand resting lightly on the drawing still folded in her coat pocket. She thought about that day on the bridge, often not with shame, not even with pain anymore, but with gratitude, for the man who had stopped, for the words that had found her when none of hers could, for the second chance at being alive, and the courage to make that life mean something. We talk so often about heroes, loud ones, decorated ones, those who wear capes or hold microphones. But maybe, just maybe, the real heroes are the ones who show up quietly, who carry no armor, but compassion, who save lives not with grand gestures, but with steady presence. The ones who speak a sentence that reaches deep into the silence of another soul and pulls it gently toward the light. Caleb Morris never asked for recognition, but for the children who rode his bus, for the woman who almost jumped, and for the strangers he'll never meet, he was the reason they believed in humanity again. And in a world so quick to overlook the ordinary, sometimes the deepest life lessons come from the humblest black stories, like his whispered between the rattle of bus wheels and the warmth of morning sun. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true life stories that remind us of the power of quiet kindness. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the smallest voice can save a life.